Okay, well, we've kind of alluded to the fact that there are lots of different ways to grieve, and I want to introduce just this idea of the continuum of grieving styles, because personality can come into it, cultural background can come into it, and also your own expectations about how you work through grief can come into this whole thing. Now, and I found this really, really helpful because a lot of times you go through loss and people expect you to grieve in a particular way, and you don't always do that, and people then look at you kind of weirdly about like, well, do you, are you not affected, and so on. So the continuum of grieving styles is on the one end there's the intuitive griever, and on the other end there is the instrumental griever. They're just different ways of approaching grief. They're not, neither is right, neither is wrong. They're just different ways of approaching the loss and working through your experience of loss. The intuitive griever at an extreme, an intuitive griever will be totally in touch with their feelings and with how they're being affected by the loss. They're going to be really possibly very emotive. They might have lots of tears. They might be constantly remembering. They might be wanting to talk things out. They might be visiting the gravesite every day if it was a death. They might be just wearing their grief very visibly, very visibly. And often when there's a death, people in our culture expect intuitive grieving. They expect the emotion. They expect it to show up. They expect it to be there. They expect it when you go through the funeral that if you're not crying, there's something wrong with you. And by the same token, it's like once you've gone past those markers, all of that should stop. So, which is not necessarily easy to do, and not even necessarily helpful. So the intuitive griever is very connected with what's going on internally for them, and so they might have words for it, they might not, they might just feel things, and they know it's about the loss, intuitively, if not literally. So they are very much in touch with what the loss is doing for them. The instrumental griever is also in tune with the loss, but they express it differently. The instrumental griever may come across as being quite emotionless, but that doesn't mean they're not feeling anything. What's happening for the instrumental griever is that they actually prefer to process their grief through activity and through doing something. So whereas the intuitive griever is very much, I need to feel what I feel and really get in touch with that. The instrumental griever says, I need to do something to mark my grief. So an instrumental griever might do something like they will be the ones at a funeral who will be organizing all the details. So that's almost their I'm processing through what it is, what my loss is, and honoring my loss by doing all the activities and being the organizer of this, that, and the other. The instrumental griever may go for long walks. The instrumental griever may do some physically hard work. They might build something. They might create something. Their grieving is expressed in the form of some kind of activity. So, and you may not see the emotion on their face or in their body, but the emotion is being funneled into this activity, and the energy to do that activity is coming out of their grief. Okay, so you may find the instrumental griever may be the one that goes and reorganizes their house. And that may be a part of their process of working through their grief. They may journal and never share that with anybody, but they might just do that. That might be, they might write lots, they might do poetry. And I think everybody, like, that's at an extreme. So the instrumental griever may often be accused of not grieving at all, because people don't necessarily understand what's going on. Okay, but the grief is there. They're just expressing it differently. And it comes down to whether or not there's an expectation for people to be an intuitive griever or an instrumental griever as to what kind of response they get. I've had a number of people that have come in to work with me that have been working through grief, and they've said, but I've never cried. It's like, okay, do you need to? No, I don't. I don't feel like I don't feel like I even want to. Is there something wrong with me? And it's like, no. It's like, you don't have to cry to grieve. And just because you cry doesn't mean you are grieving. So it's just like, if you need to cry, do it. If you don't need to cry, don't cry. So it's this whole giving the permission to do what you need to do to express your grief in the way that feels right for you, because everyone's different. Everyone's different. I had a student when I was doing lecturing on a grief and loss unit said to me, it's like, when my father died, I didn't even go to the funeral. I just didn't feel that was something that I needed to do. And he got such a lot of flack from the rest of the family, because it's like, you should be there. It's your father. It's just like, and it's just like, but I didn't feel that was the right way for me to commemorate him. And I would have been going for everybody else, not for me. And it was a very brave step, I have to admit, because I mean, family pressure can be really strong in those situations of grief and loss. But he didn't. He just chose to do something different.
So you mentioned it was a continuum. So I assume that some people could do both.
Yep.
You know?
And there can be flipping between the two. You're likely to have a preference for one end of the continuum or the other, but I have a feeling, my suspicion is, and from my own experience of working through grief, I think we kind of do a bit of both, but we're more inclined to start with one than the other.
And so, I'm curious, you mentioned journaling as part of the
grieving process.
No, not for the, I'm thinking of the intuitive side.
The instrumental.
The instrumental, which really surprised me, because I was thinking that the instrumental people wouldn't necessarily be in touch with their feelings. This is one of my questions is, if you're bringing out that grief as an activity, how aware are you of grief as a feeling? Or is it you're just doing something with it? And for me, I think of journaling as something that is an emotional process. And so I was thinking it was going to be more intuitive. So I'm actually surprised you mentioned it on the
It could be both. It could be both intuitive and instrumental. It depends, I guess, what the person puts into the journaling. So for the instrumental person, they might be wanting to keep a record. They might be recording memories. And of course, there is an emotional component to that, but that's not primarily where the instrumental person is focusing. So they're actually creating something that can hold the emotions that they may not be able to express any other way.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
So the intuitive would journal and they'd sit there and say, I'm feeling like this, and it's just like my world has ended, and and they would be really getting into the experience of the feelings. And whereas the instrumental is not so much about the experience of the feelings, but what do I do with the feelings? What do I do with those feelings? And what is it that I need to do to help me to make peace with them? So, and the intuitive griever, I suspect, eventually gets to may actually want to do something instrumental as well, because they may want something to be a reminder for them, or they may not. But yeah, I think most people are a blend of the two, but your starting point may vary. And I think from my own experience as well, it can depend too upon the circumstances in which the loss happens, because you may not have the leisure to be an intuitive griever because of the situation that you find yourself in. Or you may not have the opportunity to be able to do your commemoration, but you're carrying all the feelings. And it's just kind of like, oh, what do I do with it? And yeah, so it's not. I don't think it's a cut and dry that it's your personality or this, that, and the other. I think there's a blend of what your natural inclinations are, coupled with the circumstances in which the loss happens, and what you're able to do.
And it's interesting how I think in different social circumstances in different cultures, one of those forms is more socially acceptable than the other. and
Yes.
the challenges that raises for people as they're trying to negotiate their own grieving process, and how much
Yes.
judgment there can be around that grieving process.
There can be a lot of judgment around the grieving process, which leads again to the disenfranchised grief. It's like, no, you're not allowed to grieve that thing, or you're not allowed to grieve like that. You can get both of those things going on. And yeah, so how do you work through that? That can compound the grief in some respects, because it's like, I feel like I need to do this, but that's being socially frowned upon. So how do I make sense of this? I feel I need to do this, but I'm not being allowed to do it, and nobody will witness this for me. And maybe the witnessing is what I need to be able to do that, but nobody's there to witness it for me. So it doesn't feel like I can actually complete my process without doing this and without having witnesses around to it. So
Because I've got a sense that our bodies, like intuitively and instinctively, we get a sense of how we're meant to grieve each particular loss once we've acknowledged it and accepted it, that it's happening.
yeah.
But then it's the allowing ourselves or being allowed to follow those instincts to complete.
Yes. And I mean, who knows? I mean, some grieving processes might be things that scare people. I have known when we were up in Papua New Guinea, when somebody died, if you're a spouse or a very close relative to the person that died, you were given permission to chop off the end of a finger to commemorate the loss. And we kind of sit there and go, that's horrible. That's like self-harming. That's like whatever. But in that culture, that was one of the things that they did to acknowledge how big the grief was. It's like, I've lost a piece of myself, quite literally. It was a bit from my perspective, but that was just something that people did. And so it's like, this is a deep grief for me. It's so deep that I'm prepared to lose a piece of myself to show people how deep my grief is.
Yeah, interesting. Wow.
So, but I mean, you get people that might do cutting or this, that, and the other in response to their grief, because they're just feeling in their body something so strong that it doesn't seem to have any outlet. And for some reason, the physical expression like that seems to provide some kind of relief, perhaps, or some way to keep things keep them remembering. I had a client who lost a child for no reason at all. She just came home to find her child dead, a teenager. And she was a mess, an absolute mess, and really, really wanting to know why. She was trying to get autopsies to work out, like, what was the cause of death. This doesn't make any sense. This, and there wasn't a cause of death that could be discerned. They couldn't define it. And by the time she was talking to me, it had been probably close to a year since the child had died, and of course, there was multiple levels of that. There was like, it was an only child. It was she wasn't with the father anymore. There was things that the routine of the house, all that kind of stuff. It was all tied into it. And what she did, one of her strategies was that she got a tattoo. She got a tattoo that was specifically about her son. And she had the symbolism there that represented what she wanted to say. She had his name, she had this, that, and the other, and it was her way of grieving the loss and coming to terms with the fact that he died, and she doesn't know why. And can she move on with life and still keep him a part of her life, even though he's not physically present anymore? It was heartbreaking to work with her, because I mean, she was clearly feeling the loss on a very, very strong level. And I remember there was this one occasion where she just sort of like burst into really loud tears and, I miss my son. And really loud, and it was just like needing to almost yell it out, as I miss my son, and copious tears, and it was just like, for me, holding that space for her and allowing her to do that was a privilege, and it was really difficult too. So, but it seemed like a lot of people were just saying, well, it's been close to a year, you should be over this by now. It's like, how do you move on from this?
Yeah.
It's like, And I think at times we are so uncomfortable ourselves with someone else's grief that we give people, we try and rush them through and make them bury their grief process so that we feel better.